Home stories arrive already carrying their own smoke. One of them is now told online as the tale of a bomber gunner who used a suicidal tactic to destroy 12 Bf-109s in 4 minutes and leave a permanent mark on air combat. The exact modern version of that story appears mostly in recent viral retellings rather than in a clean official combat record, which means the number, the timing, and even the identity attached to the story have to be treated with caution. But the fear at the center of it is real enough to feel with your hands. A gunner alone in the rear of a heavy bomber, enemy fighters forming up behind him, and a few shrinking seconds in which following the rule book may feel no safer than breaking it. That is what makes the story worth telling. Not because war needs another miracle, and not because a perfect number automatically makes a perfect truth, but because it points straight at the problem bomber crews actually lived with. American heavy bomber doctrine in the war was built around daylight precision bombing. The aircraft were supposed to survive by flying in formation, combining their guns into overlapping defensive zones, and forcing attacking fighters to run a gauntlet of .50 caliber fire. The formation was the shield. The system was the answer. And on paper, that answer looked powerful. But systems do not fight on paper. They fight in moments. A formation might be the bomber's best defense in general, yet the individual men inside that formation still experience the battle as isolated points of terror. The tail gunner felt this more than most. He was out at the far end, exposed, separated, staring directly into the line from which a fighter would appear. Imperial War Museums preserves testimony from a B-17 crewman who remembered just how lonely the tail position felt. That detail matters because the hidden flaw in any doctrine of collective defense is that the individual still has to survive the seconds before the collective can save him. If those seconds belong to the attacker, the whole theory starts to crack. And that crack was not theoretical. By 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had already learned that modern aerial defense could shred confident assumptions. The National World War II Museum notes that losses during the campaign became so severe that during what became known as Black Week, the bombing effort had to be reconsidered at the theater level. In other words, the bomber force was already paying in blood for every gap between doctrine and reality. Every crew that climbed into the sky knew that best defense did not mean safe. It meant tested. It meant temporary. It meant that if the enemy found the rhythm of your formation before you found his, you could disappear inside a lesson the Air Force had not yet finished learning. That is the ground beneath the legend, not certainty but pressure, not myth alone but a real environment in which a rear gunner could look at the accepted pattern of combat and decide that something inside it was failing. The usual logic of defense is simple. Hold your fire, wait for the attacker to commit, then hit him when he cannot easily break away. In a classroom, that sounds disciplined. In the air, against fast-closing fighters, it could also mean giving the attacker the initiative, the timing, and the first clean shot. So the flaw, in the version of the story that endures, was not weak guns or cowardly crews. It was delay. It was the fatal difference between reacting to an attack and disrupting one before it fully formed. The gunner at the center of this story, whether remembered perfectly or not, is compelling because he supposedly sees that pattern before everyone else around him is willing to admit it. He notices that the danger does not begin when the fighters open fire. It begins when they settle, when they line up, when they stop improvising and start executing. At that moment, the bomber is already halfway into trouble because the enemy has chosen the angle, the closing speed, and the emotional temperature of the fight. What looks like patience from the gunner's side may look like permission from the pilot's side of the gun sight. And once that idea takes hold, the old method starts to feel less like discipline and more like surrender with extra steps. But even when a man sees the flaw, he is still trapped inside the machine that created it. Rules are not only written in manuals, they live in training, in habit, in what other crews call sane, and in what no one wants to explain to a superior after the mission. A gunner who fires too early risks being dismissed as wasteful, reckless, excited, or worse. He could burn ammunition. He could give away his intent. He could expose himself. He could start shooting before anyone else believes the attack is real. That is why the tactic in the legend is called suicidal. It is not just dangerous because it is aggressive. It is dangerous because it requires a man to act before the system around him can fully approve what he is doing. So the decision, when it comes, is not cinematic in the glamorous sense. It is small. It is internal. It is a choice about timing. In the surviving retellings, the gunner does not wait for the neat, close, textbook moment. He opens fire early, at a range, and in a manner that makes sense only if his real target is not a single fighter, but the attack sequence itself. The goal is no longer just to hit metal. It is to damage confidence, force evasive movement, spoil alignment, and make the enemy fly his own aircraft instead of his planned pass. That is the hidden elegance of the so-called suicidal move. It is not madness, it is initiative, purchased at the price of looking mad. From there, the tactic has to become physical. Every idea in combat must eventually pass through hands, eyes, muscle memory, and fear. The gunner braces the position, studies the closure, feels the limited time available to track and fire, and commits himself to acting earlier than training wants him to. There is no official modification to install, no stamped instruction, no engineer signing off on a new device. The workaround is human. It lives in sight picture, trigger discipline, and nerve. That makes it fragile. If it fails, it looks like panic. If it works, it looks obvious after the fact. Most battlefield innovation has that curse. Then comes the test. The fighters are no longer abstract. They are coming in. The line is tightening. The rear of the bomber, which a moment ago felt like a lonely little compartment, becomes the hinge on which the next few seconds will turn. In the old logic, this is where the gunner would hold, let the enemy grow larger, and trust that closer range will compensate for shorter time. In the new logic, he fires into the enemy's preparation, not his completion. The first burst is not just a shot. It is an interruption. It tells the attacker that the bomber is not going to wait politely for its own destruction. And once one pass is broken, the geometry of the next pass begins to change with it. This is the point where the legend accelerates. The first fighter does not arrive on the terms it expected. The second enters a space already disturbed. The third no longer sees a passive target, but an armed position behaving with the initiative usually reserved for the attacker. Momentum, which a few seconds earlier belonged to the fighters, starts leaking away. The gunner's bursts are not magic. They do not make metal invulnerable. They do something more important in a crowded fight. They force decisions. Break now or continue. Climb or press. Hold the line or spoil the run. In the most dramatic versions of the story, the count rises with shocking speed, until the retelling reaches its unforgettable claim of 12 BF-109s in 4 minutes. Whether every one of those seconds and every one of those victories would survive strict archival scrutiny is another question. But the tactical idea at the center of the story is easy to understand. Once the attackers lose rhythm, they stop behaving like a sequence and start behaving like individuals. That is when survival becomes possible. And witnesses would notice that before any historian did. In any combat unit, men can tell when something familiar starts happening differently. They may not agree on the reason, they may not even agree on the number, but they know when an engagement that should have ended one way suddenly ends another. That is how battlefield change often begins. Not with doctrine rewritten at a desk, but with crews asking each other what they saw, why that pass broke early, why a fighter turned off sooner than expected, why one gun position seemed to be dictating tempo instead of merely enduring it. War listens first through rumor. The broader record of bomber combat helps explain why such a story could spread and survive. We know from official award citations that extraordinary gunner actions were not fantasy. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, a tail gunner in a B-17, was officially cited for heroism on July 30th, 1943, after destroying enemy aircraft while wounded, with one gun jammed, his oxygen line broken, and the interphone inoperative. He stayed at his post, repaired the gun, resumed firing, and destroyed a fourth airplane. That does not prove the later viral claim word for word. It does prove that bomber gunners could fight through conditions that sound impossible when told plainly. Once you accept that reality, legends of aggressive gunnery stop sounding like comic books and start sounding like the war's tendency to compress truth into sharper shapes. What happens next in stories like this is rarely official at first. No institution likes to admit that its people solved a problem in the margins before the center caught up. So the change, if it spreads sideways, crew to crew, briefing to briefing, one veteran telling another not just where to look but when to act. The language may stay informal, the paperwork may lag behind, but the lesson moves because it works often enough to be remembered. Not every crew can reproduce another crew's nerve. Not every gunner sees the same angle. Not every burst changes a fight. Yet the principle survives because it offers something doctrine alone cannot give. A way for the man in the worst seat to seize one fragment of control. History, of course, is bigger than one fragment. Air combat did not change because of a single gunner, a single mission, or a single burst of defiance. Bomber formations evolved, escorts became increasingly decisive, and the entire strategic bombing system adapted under pressure. The Smithsonian notes that even the heavy defensive fire of B-17S was not enough by itself. Survival ultimately depended on escorts minimizing bomber exposure to German fighters. That matters, because it places the legend where it belongs. Not as a complete explanation, but as one vivid example of how men inside imperfect systems kept experimenting until larger solutions arrived. So the lasting power of this story is not that it gives us a clean hero with a clean number. It is that it captures a real wartime truth about adaptation. Somewhere in the rear of a bomber, under pressure no manual could fully describe, a gunner understood that waiting was also a choice. He chose to interrupt the enemy instead of merely receive him. Maybe the final tally was repeated, polished or enlarged as the years went on. War does that to memory. But memory usually enlarges what people felt mattered, and what mattered here was the reversal. For a few minutes, the hunted shaped the hunt. That is why the story survives, even in imperfect form, not because history is careless, but because history remembers moments when human beings sense the limit of a doctrine and push past it before permission arrives. A hidden flaw, an unofficial solution, proof under fire, then legacy, often without full credit. That pattern is bigger than one bomber and older than one war. But in this case, it takes the shape of a lone gunner staring backward into danger and deciding that the most dangerous move might also be the only one that could break the attack before it broke him. And whether the number was 12 or less than 12, Whether the 4 minutes were exact or only close enough to survive retelling, the meaning remains. Initiative, once seized, can make even a defensive weapon feel like a turning point.